So what do you need to live? What do you need to live? It's not a rhetorical question. It's an actual, real, interactive kind of question. So what do you need to live? Water. Air to breathe. Yeah. What's that? Food. Air. Yeah. Life gets really hard after about 5 minutes with no air. Water. You'd be really unhappy living in the desert with no water. And food. Well, it's right after Thanksgiving. Maybe we could go for a little while without food. What else? But what else do you need? I mean, yeah, the things that shelter, we need shelter, we need clothing, we need those things that take care of our physical needs, right? What else? Relationships. We need other people. It's hard to be fulfilled in this life. I would say it's impossible to be fulfilled in this life without other people. And I would say, too, that it's hard to get by in this life, if not impossible, without hope. Without hope, even the smallest challenge can be deadly, and larger setbacks cannot possibly be overcome. We need hope. We need that vision of possibility, of a future that's different than now, that actually inspires us to do things, to make things different. Now, the people of Israel, God's chosen people, they knew about hope. And like I said, the thing that we need to remember about hope is that it's something completely different from wishing, because hope inspires action. Hope inspires change. Brian McLaren writes, wishing is a substitute for action. Wishing creates a kind of positive optimism that says, everything will turn out fine. Why work? Why struggle? Why sacrifice? Why plan? It'll all be good. Well, what happens to people who don't plan, sacrifice, or struggle? It usually doesn't turn out the way they want things to turn out. It's hope that inspires and empowers us to make changes and to work hard for a future that is different than the present. And the prophets in the Bible, they are the custodians of hope. They are the people that remind everyone that hope is real. And they speak of the truth about God, the truth about the people of God, and the truth about the situation. So sometimes that news is not good, because there is a lot of news in the world that is not good. There is a lot of suffering. There is a lot of pain. There is a lot of death. There's a lot of war. And the prophets tell the truth. They tell the truth about the brokenness of the world. But that word of brokenness, that word even of judgment, is never without a word of encouragement that with God, a different world is possible. The book of Isaiah is perhaps the most important prophetic book in the Bible. It's the one that Jesus refers to the most. And it's the one that the writers of the New Testament refer to more than any other. There are many pictures of Jesus in the book of Isaiah. But it's also a book of incredible hope. You might remember last week we started the book of Isaiah, and the first chapter was not very uplifting. It was the story of brokenness. It was, things are not working in Israel. There's no compassion. The orphan and the widow aren't cared for. The poor are oppressed. There's no concern for community. There's no concern for worship, proper worship that really pulls people into the God of compassion. It was bad. It was a bad situation. And Isaiah says, this is bad, and it's going to get worse if things don't change. But then there is a word of hope. When things get really, really bad, the word of hope comes into the darkness. As you know, the story is, the kingdom of Israel comes together under the first king, King Saul. And he pulls the 12 tribes of Israel together so that they form a unified nation. He's the first king. They conquer their enemies. They have an area of safety and security. And then Saul kind of forgets about God, and he gets killed. He gets killed in battle. But then David, the best king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, the man who was so close with God. He wrote Psalms to God, the author of the 23rd Psalm that we all know, the Lord is my shepherd. He's the king for a while, and he does great things. He expands the kingdom, secures the borders. And then he dies, and his son Solomon takes over. And perhaps you remember Solomon as the wisest man. Well, he was wise, but there were some ways where he wasn't too smart. So if you can imagine this, the king enslaves some of the people of Israel in order to build the temple of God and his palace. Do you see the irony there? We're going to use slave labor to build a temple for the God who frees slaves. Not too sharp. Just not too sharp. And so after Solomon, things really start to fall apart because his son Rehoboam says, well, you thought things were bad under my dad, that he was oppressive and put you into slavery and overtaxed you? Well, guess what? Taxes are going up. There's a good leadership speech, right? That always wins people over when your newly elected, newly appointed leader says this is going to get worse. Well, they said, we're done. The 10 northern tribes said, we're done. They broke off and they formed their own kingdom. And then the tribes of Judah and Benjamin stayed with Rehoboam. And Isaiah is right, and he's saying, this is not good. Look at the situation. And so not too long after that, in 722 BC, the Assyrians come and conquer the northern kingdom. And the way the Assyrians managed their empire was they would come in and they would deport a huge chunk of the people and then move in people from another segment of the empire. So your community cohesion just disappears, right? Your culture gets destroyed. Your leaders are disappeared. Really good technique for oppressing people. But then what happens to those people, to those 10 tribes? Have you ever heard the phrase, the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Well, those are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They disappeared. Gone. And the people that were left intermarried with the foreigners that came, and so the people of Judah, those 2 tribes that were still intact, they said, you guys are not real Israelites anymore. And hatred developed between the 2 groups that lasted for hundreds of years. As you might remember, the capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria, and you might remember that Samaritans and Jews didn't get along even hundreds of years later in Jesus' time. So a little bit later on, in 587, it gets even worse. And the Babylonians destroy Jerusalem, burn the temple to the ground, and take the brightest and the best of the Jewish leaders to exile in Babylon. And it's in this situation where how could it possibly get any worse? 10 tribes are already gone. The northern kingdom's disappeared. And now it looks like, and the temple is burned to the ground. Where is God? I mean, think about it. Where is God if the temple is gone? These people could barely wrap their minds around this. The temple of God, the place where God dwells, where God comes down to earth and has contact with humans, gone. And they're in exile. They're in a foreign land. And it is precisely in this darkest moment, when it seems like nothing good can happen, that Isaiah brings a word of hope. That Isaiah says, God has not abandoned you. You are not alone. On the other side of the experience of destruction and despair, a new word comes to the people of Judah. The words that get spoken are not those of lament, but words of good news, right? Jerusalem is no longer told to wail, but to raise her voice without fear. The message is, here is your God. Here is a God who comes to feed the flock, to gather the lambs, to lead the mother sheep, to bring comfort. Here is a God in whom the people can have hope, in whom we can have hope. And you see, the thing is this was a long-term thing, right? It was a long-term thing, because these words that Isaiah speaks, it takes a long time. It takes 70 years. They're in exile for 70 years before they come back. But they do come back. And Isaiah gives them that vision that yes, things will be different. So that when the opportunity comes for people like Ezra and Nehemiah to approach the king of Persia and say, could we go back? Could we rebuild the temple? They're ready. They're ready to seize that moment because they have hope. Because they know that things could be different. Because they know that God is still active in the world. 70 years, they could have totally given up, right? They could have said, things are never going to change. Look, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, they're gone. We're going to be gone too. Our fate will be the same as theirs. But they had a word of hope that they hung on to. And that God's people continued to hang on to. In the time of the Persians, in the time that came after that, in the time before Jesus, when the Jewish people were really oppressed and then oppressed by the Romans, they held on to hope. They held on to the possibility that God was still at work and that things would be different. And when Jesus came into the world, there were a huge number of people, small at first, but expanding bunch of people who saw that hope realized, who saw things begin to change, who saw people begin to change, who saw everything begin to change. When I was reading this week, preparing for this, I read a story about hope, about this guy named Ard Aman. He was the director of pediatric immunology and clinical research at the University of California in San Francisco back in the 80s. So back then, he saw this patient, he saw this woman who was a prostitute and her 3 children. And the woman had AIDS. And it became clear that the 3 children had AIDS too. And so he was the first person to discover that AIDS could be passed from mother to child. He was the first person to figure this out. And that's a terrible thing to find out. But what it did for him was he said, you know, I need to do something about this. I need to try to help people. And so he got resources together and he helped people in the United States. But then, of course, the huge AIDS epidemic was in Africa, right? So he got people together to go to Africa to help people there. And remember, you know, by then it's like the late 80s, but this is the late 80s. You know, there are no real treatments yet. The only treatment is care, contact, compassion, hope. And so he said, you know, I don't have a set plan for what to do, but I know that we can care for people's needs. I know we can treat symptoms. I know we can make life better. We can make it better than it would be otherwise. And that's what hope is about. He said, I do not believe that God calls us to find a cure for AIDS or for poverty or for universal pain and suffering. But I do believe that he wants us to reach out to individuals whom God places in our path with a healing touch and with words of tenderness, love, forgiveness, and hope. And see, I think that is something, that's what it means to follow Jesus, right? To bring words of comfort and hope. To do what we can for the person that God has placed before us. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people in this room who will do great things for God. Right? Who will make discoveries, who will lead movements, who will amass millions of dollars to do things. Who knows? Who knows what God could call any of us to do? But here's the thing. Even if not, God does call us to bless the person, to love the person, to treat with compassion the person who's right in front of us. So that we translate that hope that God has given us into action in the present. And we keep on acting that way. We keep on making the world a little bit better no matter what disappointments we have, no matter what setbacks or delays we face, because we know the future that God is making. God certainly does call all of us to love the people that God has placed before us, to reach into their lives with compassion and generosity. Because if you think about it, that is precisely the hope that Israel was given in Jesus. Because what did Jesus do? Did Jesus lead a revolution? Did Jesus start an amazing business? Did Jesus start a brand new educational program? No, Jesus reached out his hand and healed the leper, and everything began to change. And God calls us to reach out our hand in compassion, however that may be, just like Christ. Thanks be to God.